Have you ever heard of Venezuela, a country that has the world's largest verified oil reserves, but its citizens suffer from malnutrition? How did this happen? How did Venezuela's economy get so terribly bad? In this video, we'll explore the fascinating history of Venezuela's economic transformation, marked by riches, strangeness, and atrocity, and how it became the worst economic disaster in history. From Juan Vicente Gomez's ruling to President Medina's attempt to renegotiate the country's oil contract and President Jimenez's ambitious plan, we'll delve into the rise and fall of Venezuela's economy and why it is now the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, despite having the world's largest verified oil reserves. So, stick around until the end to learn more about Venezuela's strange and heartbreaking economic story. A small portion of your gas purchases went to Venezuela, a country many people can't find on the map. From highway asphalt to tire rubber to electronics, shoes, shampoo, smartphones, furniture, and more, Venezuela's petroleum is everywhere. This makes Venezuela's economy one of the most peculiar economies on the planet. Venezuelans in the sprawling slums around Caracas struggle to buy food, toilet paper, and shoes, but the same $50 gasoline tank is nearly free. They still have satellite TV, and some borrow money for their children's cosmetic surgeries. In 2010, a Venezuelan could exchange currency and return from Paris with 7 years minimum wage. Glitzy hotels can be the most expensive or cheapest in the world, depending on exchange rates, and many people spend rather than save. Despite having the world's largest verified oil reserves, Venezuelans lost 8.7 kilograms in 2017 due to malnutrition. It imports almost everything it needs and produces little. Venezuela, richer than the UK, is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela's massive crude oil reserves and their corrupting effect on leaders caused this economic transformation, marked by riches, strangeness, and atrocity. Venezuela, the world's strangest economy, is the worst economic disaster in history. On July 31st, 1914, Venezuela's first commercial oil were erupted and spilled thick, black, viscous liquid from a 400-foot hole, changing the country's fate. Venezuela was a backwater Andean nation ruled by Juan Vicente Gomez, who took power in 1908 and ruled until his death. In exchange for support, Gomez allowed foreign companies to explore, drill, and extract oil without taxes or royalties. He granted oil concessions, favors, and loyalists who relied on oil revenue. This kept them in power and rich. Venezuela became the world's second largest oil producer in 21 years, providing 2/3 of the government's income and 90% of its exports. Gomez and his supporters benefited most from oil money, but ordinary Venezuelans did too. The first banks and the high-paying oil industry supported a service economy. Farmers moved to cities for oil wealth. In the early 20th century, oil demand and Venezuela's bolivar currency rose, causing this boom. This made Venezuelan exports more expensive and foreign imports cheaper. Producers couldn't export while consumers realized foreign goods were cheaper. The US let the dollar fall during the Great Depression. One of the world's strongest currencies, the bolivar, rose 70%. Venezuelans imported luxury goods, used modern amenities, and got good jobs. Their society became oil dependent. Business costs, wages, and prices in Venezuela were tied to its overvalued currency by the late 1930s. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was surprised by the initial report on how the influx of people, cities, raised living costs. By 1939, Caracas was the most expensive city in the world, with a ruling elite that monopolized paper, beef, and dairy. The opposition was suppressed, and the government was given control over all state revenues. After Gomez died in 1935, the Venezuelan government took over his industries, and his authoritarian rule influenced future leaders. After World War II, President Medina attempted to renegotiate the country's oil contracts. President Roosevelt and legal advisors helped pass the 50-50 principle, which made the Venezuelan state equal partners in the oil industry and entitled them to half of the oil profits. However, lawmaker Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso discovered that this made Venezuelan oil less profitable than Middle Eastern oil. So, Venezuela shared the principle with the other Middle Eastern oil-producing nations, who soon adopted similar laws. After the war, Venezuela received the most foreign currency, so it heavily subsidized gas prices to meet demand. However, all sectors of society demanded a larger share of oil revenue, including the military, which dominated Venezuelan politics for decades. A civilian junta government and a universal suffrage followed President Medina's ouster. The military again overthrew the president and installed President Jimenez. Jimenez, like Gomez, was a dictator who suppressed political parties, tortured opponents, and rigged the 1952 elections by demanding a more accurate count. Despite these actions, Venezuela's economy was booming during his reign, and many Western companies were flocking to the nation due to low taxes, regulations, and a new generation of wealthy consumers. If they didn't bother Jimenez, they could do business however they wanted. Jimenez saw a prosperous Venezuela with no obstacles. Jimenez's resources enabled his ambitious plans. The Republic of Venezuela was renamed, new state-owned heavy industries were created, and ambitious public work programs were launched. Jimenez believed he could buy Venezuela's modernization. New schools, hospitals, and highways connected the nation, and the poor received new housing. Modern infrastructure, luxurious hotels, and world-class restaurants were meant to impress foreigners. The military and corporations were well funded. Jimenez's plan unraveled over time. Waste, corruption, and bribery plagued massive projects. State-owned industries lost money, new highways were too expensive, and public amenities fell short. Jimenez's military promise failure was the final blow. He fled with his family to the Dominican Republic in January 1958, after his military supervisors urged him to leave. Venezuela's economy and society started acting strangely. Most non-petroleum sectors suffered from the overvalued bolivar. The state-controlled businesses with tens of thousands of workers were the last ones standing. Wages rose despite low productivity. Only the international oil price determined payment, not competence. Luck ruled business success, since the goal was to get an easy, high-paying government job, maybe take some bribes, and funnel more of the government's oil income. There was little incentive to work harder. Due to a lack of economic diversity, most Venezuelans were unemployed despite massive social spending and state-run company funding. Food prices were kept low to avoid political fallout from the high unemployment rate. This put tremendous pressure on the struggling agriculture business, which could not profit at such prices. Venezuelans and their finances adapted to these unusual conditions. An agreement between the largest political parties allowed Venezuela's second democratic experiment. However, the oil revenue and unusual conditions were too much. Since it didn't collect taxes, democracy was unaccountable. The president had unchecked power and embraced authoritarianism, and the desire for wealth in an economy that discouraged hard work led to political corruption at all levels. Venezuela's economy kept growing. In the 1960s, OPEC, the first international petroleum cartel, was formed as presidents gradually extracted more revenue from oil companies. Oil producers set prices and outputs instead of oil companies. In October 1973, Arab nations imposed a total oil embargo on the West for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War, upending petroleum geopolitics. Oil prices skyrocketed to $14 per gallon. This situation gave Venezuela triple oil profits. However, the small country could not handle the capital influx, and officials feared uncontrollable inflation. President Perez raised wages, social spending, and job creation to combat this. Despite these efforts, inflation soared to 12% per year. Venezuelans stopped trusting banks, spending, and borrowing instead of saving. The middle class grew to 58%, but few realized their economy was fragile. Future leaders misused the government's savings to fund to offset excess oil revenue. The government grew to 300,000 employees and passed laws to prevent companies from firing workers, forcing larger companies to rely on state subsidies and small businesses to fail. The president nationalized the oil industry, halting investment. As oil prices plummeted in the 1980s, Venezuela's economy collapsed. The political structure prevented funding cuts, leading to huge debt, which was worsened by President Luis Herrera Campin's quadrupling foreign debt. The government depleted the oil fund and devalued the bolivar, making living unaffordable. Capital controls and fixed exchange rates increased corruption and black markets. Venezuela is overdependent on the world and failed to prepare for lower oil prices. causing economic turmoil and rampant inflation. Venezuelan officials sold dollars at a discount, which could be resold for up to 1,000% on the black market. Due to food price controls, people bought more than they needed to avoid shortages. As scarcity increased, people sold excess goods illegally or smuggled them to neighboring countries. These policies caused a 10% economic contraction in 1989. President Perez ended debt payments, abolished price controls, raised gas prices, and cut social spending, contrary to campaign promises. The currency dropped 60% instantly, sparking violent protests. Foreign companies received bribes, and former presidents were embezzled. Venezuelans preferred strongman dictators over saving and investing oil wealth. The democratically elected government survived a 1992 military coup. Hugo Chavez, the coup leader, became a hero to the poor and anti-corruption. Venezuela's economic crisis worsened over 6 years, with a banking crisis wiping out 11% of GDP and inflation exceeding 100%. In 1998, almost half of Venezuelans were poor, and Chavez campaigned to fight corruption and inequality. Chavez, who campaigned on democracy and private property, hosted a birthday party for Fidel Castro and grew to like socialist Cuba. He was allowed to rewrite the constitution and form a congress with his supporters by desperate voters. He declared the Bolivian Revolution and renamed Venezuela. In 2001, Chavez passed 49 laws allowing the state to seize and divide large agricultural plots. He increased state control over the oil industry with a new petroleum law. PDVSA opened its doors to foreign companies to attract capital and expertise, but critics called it a disguised privatization. Oil production increased nonetheless. Employee protests and a coup against Chavez followed his appointment of loyalists to PDVSA's board, including non-oil industry experts. The coup lasted 2 days, but thousands of PDVSA workers went on strike, halting oil production for 2 months and costing the country billions. Chavez fired nearly 20,000 employees and labeled them and their supporters enemies of the state. Chavez reinstated exchange controls, created CADIVI, and imposed price controls to fight inflation and the oil export slump. He required banks to lend cheaply to key industries and ordinary people. Venezuela had high inflation and cheap loans, which increased spending and borrowing. In the 2000s, rising oil prices and Chinese demand for commodities stabilized the situation. Despite learning from the economic turmoil of the 50s and 70s, the late President Chavez used the booming oil market to fund his socialist agenda through massive social programs, subsidies, and nationalization of major industries. He blamed the foreign capitalists for economic problems and restricted dollars, causing black market trading. Venezuelans enjoyed a dramatic improvement in quality of life, but became accustomed to a warped sense of money and economics, resulting in loans and luxury goods instead of productivity-boosting economic policies. Due to a lack of savings and economic diversification, Venezuela could not import essential resources when oil prices dropped in 2008 and 2014. Millions have fled and inflation has reached 65,000%. Maduro, Chavez's successor, follows his principles while undermining democracy. This shows that misusing money is worse than having none. Thank you for watching this video on how Venezuela's economy got so terribly bad. From the country's early days as a backwater Andean nation to the boom times of the 20th century and the subsequent economic collapse, it's clear that the story of Venezuela's economy is a complex one. As we've seen, the massive oil reserves that once made Venezuela rich ultimately proved to be its downfall due to corruption, mismanagement, and a failure to diversify the economy. The result has been a devastating economic crisis with hyperinflation, food shortages, and widespread poverty. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more informative content.